I am delighted to welcome you to the last seminar of the summer series. Today we have Tim Folta, who is professor at University of Connecticut, presenting his work on whether governments fund the best entrepreneurial ventures. And we have Daniel Armanios, who is assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon, as our discussant. Some housekeeping rules: we will have Tim presenting for about 35 minutes, and then Daniel presenting his comments for about 10 minutes. After that, there will be plenty of time for your questions. So I kindly encourage you to write any questions you might have in the Q&A chat. And should you have any burning clarification questions, please raise your hand and we will unmute you so you have a chance to ask them throughout the presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to thank everyone for joining, and I will let Tim share his screen and start with the presentation.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes, we can, and we can see your screen.
Excellent. Okay, I'm getting some messages that my internet is unstable, so I have my technical sidekick handy if that happens. So I may be gone temporarily if something happens. Hey, I'm happy to be here today. This is a paper that just got accepted a month or so ago, actually after I committed to this presentation. So it's in Academy of Management Discoveries. My co-authors, the lead author, Supradeep Dutta, fabulous co-author, and my current doctoral student, Jenna Rodrigues, and it's joint work with those folks. So here we investigate a question about whether governments select appropriately for their entrepreneurial funding. And as you know, this is an important question because governments around the world, local, federal, regional, are trying to spur economic activity by funding entrepreneurial ventures. And it's not clear that they should play in this space. There is a literature that comes down on both sides of the argument. Some say that they should do it, others say that they shouldn't, and I'll elaborate a bit more. But so whether governments can actually select the best ventures to fund, in other words, ventures that are going to indeed spur economic activity, is really a fundamental question. And an important one, because billions and billions of dollars are spent each year, not just in the SBIR program that we're going to investigate, but worldwide. So just to kick it off, the space, the particular program we're going to focus on is the SBIR program. And I think it's fair to say that this program is the United States' premier program in funding entrepreneurial ventures. 2.73 billion were funded in 2018 for the last decade, roughly $25 billion. And I think it's fair to say that this dwarfs any other entrepreneurial program around the country. And so, interesting question: do they choose the right projects? Secondary question we're going to investigate is whether they fund risky projects or not. If you go to the SBIR website, you'll see that one of their primary objectives is to fund technologically risky projects, ventures with risky technological outcomes. And if you think about it, it makes sense. They want to fund ventures that really make a difference, and ventures that make a difference are more complex. And they have more variance in outcomes. Some are going to really hit home runs, and others are going to fail because they are more risky. And so, a reasonable expectation is that SBIR should indeed fund riskier projects, and we're going to investigate this as well. To start out, why is this of interest? Some of you, maybe particularly those in Europe, may think this is a no-brainer. Government should play an important role. Indeed, they are playing an important role around the country, but there are lots of folks that argue otherwise. Some reasons for government intervention include, there's underinvestment in private research that have important societal implications. For example, green energy. So these sorts of risky ventures might not otherwise get funded, so government steps in and fills this gap. Lynn argues that investment by the government may accentuate a country's comparative advantage, may inspire new technological landscapes for a country or a region or a locale. Others argue that it should complement private sector investment, so they should work hand in hand. And then one reason to do it is it might provide an important signal to private investors that indeed this venture is worth examining, because a set of examiners that understand technological prowess have indeed decided to commit funds to the venture. The reasons against it are just as plentiful. Why should the government do it? Because they don't have the capability. They don't have folks that, they're not venture capitalists. They don't have people with the same experience. They should let the market invest in these opportunities, and because they'll do it more efficiently. They lack expertise. There are all sorts of biases and processes that governments establish. A big one is, when the government's involved, lobbying may actually play an important role. So there are these distortions associated with interest groups. For example, certain regions of the country might get funded, ventures from certain regions might get funded more than others, or with a certain technological platform or whatnot. Finally, there is a multiplicity of objectives in the SBIR mandate, and that may confound the ability to select the most promising ventures. So for example, they want to fund, they have a certain mandate to fund minority and women-owned ventures. And it's possible that this multiplicity of objectives may compromise economic output. So these are some reasons against doing it. Okay, so I want to start off by just emphasizing that our focus is on selection. We are not examining treatment. Okay, I've presented this paper multiple times, and the audience, and in fact you, may want me to study treatment, but I am not studying treatment. I am studying selection here. I'm looking at whether they actually choose the right projects. Now, there are lots of studies that have looked at outcomes associated with the SBIR program. And most of them do not control, nearly all of them do not control for selection or treatment. They do not distinguish between the two, okay? They do find that SBIR funded firms do well, but the bottom line is we don't know whether it's due to selection or treatment. As far as I know, I've only seen 2 studies look at this question with regards to the SBIR program, and they focused on treatment effects. Walston and Howell. Walston came along in 2000, and he basically found that after controlling for selection, SBIR funded projects did not do any better than non-SBIR funded projects. Howell found just the opposite. Howell found that, I think she focused on the Department of Defense, and she found, she had a sample of firms that applied but didn't get the money. And she found that there was a significant improvement in treatment effects associated with firms that got the money. So So in the two studies, maybe Daniel or Chiara or some other member of the audience knows other studies that have looked at this treatment versus selection, but as far as I know, there's only two that are focused on treatment. And selection is relatively ignored in the SBIR program, as far as I know. The folks I mentioned above, Walston and Howell, have controlled for selection, but they haven't focused on whether these programs, the SBIR program, funds, chooses the right ventures to fund, okay? And that's our focus here. So in particular, you might think about this, I'm pointing towards our empirical analysis. You can think about these as hypotheses if you want, or questions that we're going to investigate. Does SBIR prioritize the ventures with the highest commercial potential, with the highest technological potential, and with the highest technical and commercial risk, and the riskiest projects? So we think our contribution is that we're focusing on selection. It hasn't been looked at before. It's an important question because governments want to know the answer to this question as to whether they can actually do this effectively. Our particular focus is on the National Science Foundation. There are 11 different agencies that work through the SBIR. I think, but we look at one particular agency, the NSF, and this does have implications for other government agencies, indeed agencies around the world or governments around the world. Another contribution is it's darn hard to tease apart selection from treatment, okay? And we're going to do so using a natural experiment, okay? So I'd like to claim that we're novel here, but we actually borrowed this approach from a study that was done in research policy by Park, who looked at Research One grants. In other words, these are just research grants. They're not entrepreneurial funded grants or entrepreneurial venture grants. But here's essentially what they did. The Obama administration, at the time of the financial crisis, infused lots of money through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And different agencies got access to this money. And it worked its way to the SBIR program. And as a consequence, this was an infusion of money that was unexpected. And essentially, we now have a sample of firms that were funded through the regular cycle, and a sample of firms that were funded through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act cycle. Same grant solicitation, but we understand that the regular funded firms were prioritized. They were chosen first, and the second set of firms were evidently just below the threshold after that, right before the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So this allows us to establish a priority in terms of how the government allocated the money. Okay, so we're going to use this. I'll explain a bit more about this. Okay, so I'm going to go through quickly a few slides on the SBIR program because not everybody may be familiar with it. One of the things I wanted to highlight was, indeed, if you look at these goals, and these few slides are from the SBIR website, but you'll see that the objective is, there's a multiplicity of objectives. They seem to suggest they want to increase, they want to have an economic effect. So they want to choose the ventures that are going to have the biggest economic effect. But at the same time, the last goal suggests they have they have other objectives as well. Okay, this merely represents that a significant amount of resources were dedicated to the SBIR program. You can see that the federal government allocated 3.2% of their federal R&D budget to the SBIR program as of 2017, but this has been increasing over time, so that's a significant amount. There are 11 different agencies involved. Again, I think there's 12 now, and we're focusing only on NSF. And we're focusing on phase 1 grants. These are grants of greater than 150,000. There's also a phase 2 program and a phase 3, but our focus here is on phase 1 grants. Okay. We can see that the awards have gone to different states, but 10 states are primarily receiving them. We control for this. Let's see, this is the, this kind of represents the graph, the bar chart at the top left kind of represents the amount of money allocated to the economy, and 111 billion went to infrastructure and science. And it's that portion that was infused into the SBIR program. So of that, 2 billion was allocated to ARRA through the National Science Foundation, and a little bit through NIH, but less through NIH, National Institutes of Health. And this compares to 6.5 billion that was allocated during the regular cycle during the same time. Okay, so let's see. And so one of the, we're arguing this is a natural experiment. And so, there's a couple of criteria for these natural experiments to be appropriate, and we think this meets the criteria, and I'll explain that here. So we think it's an appropriate quasi-natural experiment because number one, we can distinguish the priority, the ventures that receive the priority. The regular funded ventures receive priority compared to the ARRA funded ventures. Secondly, the ARRA money was unexpected and it didn't influence the selection process. We confirmed this with interviews with the NSF folks, and in fact, the regular process was completed prior to the ARRA announcement. And the objectives didn't change across these two different cycles. And again, interviews confirmed that. Okay, this is just a kind of a timeline. 2008, 2009, 2010 kind of represents the financial crisis. Again, I mentioned that this was, our sample of firms is in the single grant solicitation across the ARRA cycle and the regular funded cycle. And at the bottom, you can see the regular timeline there. And it precedes the ARRA funded timeline there. Okay, I'm happy to go into more detail on this. A little bit about the sample. Okay, so we've got about 767 firms in the sample, 147 of which are ARRA funded firms, and 620 are funded through the regular budget. We essentially found the ARRA firms first and found a single grant solicitation, then went to the regular budgeted firms and found all those associated with the same grant solicitation. We complemented these SBIR firms with a number of different data sources to get our dependent variables. And we ended up with slightly less than 767, but it was 657, I guess. Okay, so a little bit about the empirical strategy. First, we're going to look for evidence about whether the regular funded firms outperform the ARRA funded firms. If they're good selectors, we would expect them to outperform the ARRA funded firms. We're also going to look to see whether regular funded firms are indeed higher risk than the ARRA funded firms. Then we're going to try to isolate the observable firm attributes that might explain selection. And just to get a sense for what NSF might focus on during the selection process. And the last one's a little bit more complicated. I'll get to that later if I have time. Okay, so here's some dependent variables, some for quality, some for riskiness. There's nothing we're inventing here. These are the typical performance, measures along commercial quality and technical quality, measuring them the same way. There's nothing new. The riskiness variables may be a bit novel here. We're, to identify a high citation patent, we create a dummy variable. If at least one patent filed by the firm in a year has a citation rate that lies in the top 10 percentile during the same year in the same patent class. Same thing with low citation patents. And here on the right-hand side, you can see some means across the two samples. And indeed, you can see that there are some significant differences between the samples, suggesting that indeed they seem to be good selectors on both quality and riskiness. The last variable, patent originality, is basically kind of, it's the idea that the more complex a technology, the more patent classes it covers. And so this is a measure that Jaffe and colleagues developed in terms of patent originality and complexity. So we think it's more novel technology, essentially. Okay, and then we have some control variables, and you'll see those at all. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so first thing, we pretty much only include the grant amount here and the ARRA variable here. And I'm excluding all the other variables that might influence selection because we're trying to ascertain whether there's a selection effect. And so the dummy for ARRA actually captures a selection effect. And so what we find here is that ARRA-funded firms, as we would hope, perform work. They have fewer patents and fewer patent citations than regular funded firms. So that would be consistent with a good selection story. Okay. And then with time to venture capital and time to IPO, we see that ARRA funded firms have longer time to venture capital and longer time to IPO. Again, significant effect. And indeed, these coefficients actually can be transferred to economic effects as depicted there on the right. So there seem to be significant economic effects. Okay, riskiness. So here we focus on our high citation patents and our low citation patents. And again, the argument is that ARRA-funded firms should be less risky. These coefficients should be negative. And indeed, we find that the ones that are prioritized, the regular budgeted firms, funded firms actually do better. So ARRA is, I think you understand, ARRA is 1, which means, and when it's 0, it's a regular. So again, they seem to prioritize the ventures that are less risky, just as we found that they seem to prioritize the ventures that produce lower quality, lower economic impact, I suppose. Okay. And again, these effects can be transferred to economic effects, as we've done there. Okay. And, you know, another part of our analysis, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. You're with me. Have you lost me at all, Chiara?
I think there was just one point where like it was breaking off, but it was one sentence. Other than that, I could hear everything.
Okay, fabulous. So some folks may be interested to know, so what does NSF focus on when they choose their ventures? So what we did here is we added a number of observable variables that were observable at the time of selection of the grant. Okay, and this is important in two respects. One, it helps us identify which cues NSF used are most valuable for selecting the projects. And here we can see that prior patents seems to be an important cue for the government. And we also see prior grants in a lot of the cases seems to be an important cue. Okay. Another thing this analysis helps us with is it helps, you know, we can see that the ARRA coefficient remains positive even after the addition of these observable variables, okay, these observable traits. And because it remains positive, although less so than it did before, because it remains positive, it suggests that there may be some unobservable capabilities that the government has that are, you know, that are involved in the selection process. And that's kind of interesting. They may have some unobservable capabilities that they've generated. And so we dug into that a little bit more. And we conducted a few interviews with NSF folks to try to understand what was the nature, or what might be the nature of these unobservable capabilities. And so what we found through these interviews was a couple things. One, there seems to be a focus on commercialization during the process. Okay, for example, they hire program directors with entrepreneurial experience or venture investing experience. Okay. Secondly, the evaluators are explicitly asked to appraise commercial potential. Now, I have to admit, we started by analyzing both NIH and NSF, and it got, you know, our examination suggested that NIH didn't care about commercial potential. They were just focused on technical potential, but NSF seems to have explicitly added to this, to their criteria, their evaluation criteria. A second capability, or second reason why they might have a capability, is that there's this iterative due diligence process. So it's not just we're going to fund you or not. It seems to be that you know, the application's given, the program director looks at it after consultation from the committee. Or even the, you know, the director may look at it before they give it to the committee. They say, you know, you need to revise it in this way, or we need more information about this. You know, you get more feedback from the committee. And so, you know, several stages happen like this where it's iterative, and that improves the process, and it helps the entrepreneur learn, and it helps the selection committee learn about the capability. So the iterative due diligence process is interesting. How am I doing, Chiara? Do I have 5 minutes maybe?
8 minutes. I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, thank you very much. A third reason why they might have a capability is they really try to get a diversity of committee experience, both technical and commercial. And they're not opposed. In fact, they actively go out and seek people, external members, with commercial experience that's relevant to the application. That's interesting, okay? So that flexibility, that desire to gain the diversity, not just diversity, but also find the specific experience is interesting. And a final explanation is that they tend to be fairly flexible. I mean, it's possible that they have a venture, they may fund a venture that's strong in one or two areas, even if they're weak in others. So, for example, in my interviews with the NSF, or our interviews, we they really mention that they like to invest in strong entrepreneurs, just like VCs. And so entrepreneurs with experience are more likely to get the money. The government's more likely to bet on those ventures. And so if they're particularly good along a few dimensions, they may get the money, even if the mean value along all dimensions is low. So they have some flexibility. So these are a few interesting findings through this interview process that suggests there may be some capabilities, some selection capabilities that go beyond just looking at the number of patents or the number of prior grants or the traditional, the magic that actually produces the positive outcome. Okay. Now I have to say that
Tim, there is a question from the audience, so I'll let Cheryl ask it now.
Okay. Oh, Cheryl, yes, I know you.
Hi, yes. Actually, I raised my hand accidentally on that. Sorry about that. It's a really interesting study, but I wasn't asking a question right that moment.
Oh,
sorry.
Thank you.
That's fine.
So now, one of the see, our dependent variables are kind of looking at performance and riskiness after the venture has been funded, after the selection has been made. And so, it's possible that it may not be selection that's causing these effects, these results that we're getting. It's possible that if indeed the ventures are slightly better, the regular funded ventures are slightly better, it's possible that they may be, the treatment effect is kind of magnified for those ventures. And so what we did is we tried to look into this as best we could, and we did a difference in difference effect. So essentially what we did is we created a match sample of ARRA funded firms and regular funded firms that were, that had similar distributions prior to the funding. And then we looked to see after the fund, whether there was a strong effect after the funding. And let me just share with you, I've got some statistics. If you're interested in the matching procedure, I can show you that. This is a visual representation here. The regular funded firms are the red ones here. And what we're looking for here, if the matching is good, we see kind of parallel lines pre-treatment, which is the treatments at T. And we're relatively satisfied that these are parallel lines. In fact, our statistical tests suggest that they are. And we see an increase there. I have to say that there doesn't seem to be any, although I was talking to my colleague about this morning. I'll show you the graph and I'll come back to this. So the table here, if we expected treatment effects, we would expect an interaction between post-grant and ARRA. And we don't get any significant effects there. Okay, so that suggests that essentially the treatment after the grant is given is essentially the same for both ARRA and regular funded firms. And see the significant ARRA effect. This to us suggests that the selection effect dominates. And this is the explanation for all the results we've seen before. It doesn't necessarily appear that way here because it looks like a little discontinuity in the red line going up, but evidently that's a straight line from T-3 to T+3, a relatively straight And maybe it's the small sample size that's giving us the insignificant effect here. But we've got, I think it's 68 firms in each sample. But nevertheless, we're reasonably confident that selection effects are strong. There may be some interesting treatment effects. So it could be that better firms benefit a bit more from this funding than otherwise. Okay. So I need to wrap up, but we've done some other tests, and I can come back to this if we have time. I want to emphasize that there seemed to be significant positive selection, good selection along technical merit, commercial merit, and riskiness. And that's good. That's good. We're allocating $2.5 billion a year, and it's nice to know that they're giving it to the good ventures or the best ventures. And I'm sorry if some people are bored by that, but that seems like an important result. And then finally, the post-grant treatment effects are small for essentially equivalent firms. This should be investigated further, but I told you what we found. Okay, so let's see, implications beyond the SBIR and in particular the NSF. So I just want to emphasize that governments appear to be able to affect selective ventures, appear to be able to effectively select ventures, and they seem to be able to generate some unobservable capabilities in doing so. And this provides an important counter-argument to the many folks who think the government should stay out of funding entrepreneurial ventures. Secondly, I think our work extends an important literature, and Daniel is certainly part of this literature, that is emphasizing government's role in actively encouraging entrepreneurial activity. So for example, Mazzucato has a great book in 2013, and our work's a little bit differentiated. She suggests that while governments can fund promising science, they generally rely on others to invest in building economic value. And we basically find that indeed governments can build economic value. While Lynn suggests governments can encourage entrepreneurship by investing in domains consistent with a country's comparative advantage, our findings suggest that they may build comparative advantage by investing in risky projects. And finally, Daniel and his colleagues emphasize that governments are increasingly asked to experiment to harness a region's growth potential, but we can confirm that they can generate capabilities to experiment through entrepreneurial investment. Okay, so we've got some limitations, as all studies do. Let's see, it might be nice to compare across more agencies. It would be nice to compare across more output measures such as employment, although I will emphasize we did look at sales and whether access to phase 2 grants were also positive for regular budgeted firms, and they were, and they did have higher sales relative to ARRA. And that's pretty much it. I think I will cede the floor at this point.
Thank you very much, Tim. We have some questions that we will take later. So I will now ask Daniel to unmute himself and share the screen.
Thank you. Let me make sure this comes through correctly. Sorry, my computer's a bit slow these days. Okay, here we go. Oh, thank you. Can everyone see my screen and the video?
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let me see if I can, 1 minute here. There we go. Okay. Let me move. I'm doing some little Zoom finagling now. Make sure I can see where everything is. Okay, perfect. All right, well, first off, I want to say it's an honor to be asked to discuss this paper by Supradeep, Tim, and Jennifer. It's a really well done paper, and I'm looking forward to discussing it. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Engineering, as Chiara said, at Carnegie Mellon. So I thought, given that the paper is forthcoming, I felt it'd be more interesting to think, take some of the limitations that Tim discussed and then try to put it in a broader perspective of what could be done. But first off, I want to just talk about why I think you should read this paper. It makes the case for government in a very different and unique way. So as Tim noted, the kind of original stance of the prior literature was that government should kind of set the playing field, but should not be an active player in it, right? And so, and you know, you mentioned the Walston case. Josh Lerner is interesting because he's kind of evolved his thinking over time. Originally, the SBIR was an important mover, government as venture capitalist, and I think he's changed over time with, and the mechanism that they seem to argue on is that the government is not equipped to pick high quality firms. Now, what's interesting is that the literature, that the prior response in the literature has been more like flank attacks. It hasn't been directly questioning that view. Does government pick better or not? And you have kind of two trends, both of which Tim kind of covered. One is that, well, if we don't have government participating, there will never be any basic science research. They won't fill the earlier stage gaps. And that's a predominant argument for government in more kind of global north countries. Think US, Europe, Canada, etc. But the other view that's come out of a lot more out of some in the global north, but more in the global south, think China, think Africa, countries in Africa, Nigeria, Rwanda, etc., is that if government does not support early stage interest towards a comparative advantage, there's already well-developed industry value chains in the more developed countries. And so if they just let the market operate freely, they're going to be stuck in low-value niches and perennially be low in their growth. And so their argument is it needs to be forced. And how do you force it? You have to cultivate through comparative advantages. But notice that these are attacks at the flanks trying to understand what the government's role is. They're not necessarily attacking the key issue, which is, do governments pick good firms? And what I like about this paper, they attack it very much head on. And they're saying that actually they seem to pick good firms. Now we can ask ourselves some interesting questions about the broader subset of firms that would choose government funding versus not. I think there's some really interesting questions to think about that. But for what they were trying to intend to do, they did it. And I think what was nice at the end of this, that I really liked, and it touches on a debate in the developmental state literature, is, you know, we spend so much time focusing on firm capabilities, and we don't think so much about government capabilities. And those matter if you're a firm, right? Because you need to understand how government skills operate so that you know how to who to connect with, what right officials. Perhaps you can collect CVs of government officials. Dan Ching Wong is doing some really interesting work out of Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, looking at literally collecting CVs of Chinese governors and party secretaries to do their own backgrounds influence what they do. And there's a big debate right now as to whether government officials should have private sector experience or not. And I don't want to spend as much time, but it really opens up a wide variety of work. The second reason to read this paper, which I think Tim did a really nice job of elaborating on, is the way they've attacked this empirically. And I share the view that he's correct on, that we usually control rather than explore selection effects. Now there's two ways that is done, right? One is more head-on, like Sabrina Howell did, where she actually had application data and could say applicants versus those who get it, what's the difference? The other way that people generally control for selection is to find shocks that they argue are unrelated to it. So they're kind of agnostic that selection happens, but they try to find a shock either in our case with our work, you know, a state match to the program that didn't have anything to do with the federal program. Or you can think of a litany of policy evaluation studies like Matt Marks's Non-Competes Act, university shocks, anything where the argument isn't selection doesn't happen, but that the shock you're looking at is unrelated to it. And so that's a more kind of difference in difference usually approach. And so what was nice about this paper was that they leveraged this unexpected windfall in Reinvestment and Recovery Act to do this and compare it to the regular funded group. And essentially the intuition is, well, if you got extra money, who would be your second choices? And can we compare them? And they did a really nice job showing that the timing of this really didn't allow NSF to do another call for proposals. They had to look at what they had and do it quickly. And I really liked, I call it a variance analysis, you could think of it differently, but I really liked that they also show that they're also not likely to have the bigger hits. They're not gonna have the lowest 10%, they're not gonna have the highest. And why I like that is because what a lot, at least recently, was giving government a bad name is they usually pick the negative wins, the Solyndras of the world and so forth. But for example, now Solyndra wasn't, to be careful, Solyndra wasn't funded through SBIR. It was funded through the Department of Energy Loan Guarantee Program. But if you want to just lump government programs in a bag, you can think of it this way. But one of the biggest successes of SBIR has been 23andMe. So 23andMe was funded through SBIR and is now widely spreading and looking at mapping the human genome. People can get different genetics tests and so on. So we've spent so much time focusing on the bad apples, we don't necessarily know the good ones. And the government response is that's what we want to do. When you're in this early stage, you don't necessarily know what you're doing. And so where is this paper taking us, in my opinion? I have several ideas, and I'll try to go through them quickly because I know I'm low on time. So the first part is, and I like the limitation of talking about performance metric. What if we start asking ourselves, what is the selector's intent? What is the intent of a public program, right? So they use in their program patent citations, VCs, IPO, absolutely makes sense. And the assumption is, which is what a lot of the literature in this place is that the public sector is a gap filler. They get the early stage ones that need a little bit of extra help and make them more attractive to private support so that they share the end of a firm going through. But I was thinking just as that, what if you think about employee growth? Now, why is this interesting? If I think of the logic or rationale of a government official, they're usually thinking not necessarily about the firm, but jobs, right? How many jobs am I going to create with this? So perhaps it'd be interesting to see if these firms do more employee growth. Maybe they have a certain kind of condition or structure that's pushed for by government. Perhaps it's the degree to which these projects enable other innovations, even if they fail. So a really nice early study in the 60s looked at all the weapon system advancements, I think from 49 to 62, and found 710 different technologies that were proliferated, irrespective of the firm or project that were used in common day work. You can think of more recent work on, the general notion of general purpose technologies. Maybe I don't care if the firm fails itself, but if they deliver a technology that everybody uses, think internet, think other things, or they create jobs, maybe I don't necessarily care if the firm succeeds. And then it makes an argument of why I'm okay with risk, right? And so what I love about this, and where some of only very few works have gone recently, is to start thinking about performance metrics more in their diversity and unpack the variance. Most of the time when we have these studies, we say, here's a performance metric. It's a typical metric. We use it, as opposed to, well, I'm looking at these kind of stakeholders. This is the kind of thing they care about. So there may be some interesting normative implications that I think would be really nice to further on with this, not just about the diversity, but what is the rationale for the selector? Now, and they touched on this as well. What does selection look like when I don't know where the technology is going? Again, most of the prior literature assumes that the government knows where the technology is going, can find the application that matches their comparative advantage, and then they can fund it accordingly. And as we've said, and Tim said, it's not always clear. Like if I think of AI, quantum computing, other sorts, we know it has a lot of potential. We don't know where the applications are necessarily right now. And it's not clear how would that fit into what Kansas is better at than Florida, or what is better in Vancouver versus Ottawa. We don't know. And so what I thought is, if we think of this more broadly, if we know that it's about riskiness, in what way do they do the riskiness? Is it just let 1,000 flowers bloom? We just fund a bunch of stuff and see what happens? Now, if you look at the DOE, for example, they have missionaries. Sometimes they don't want to have the broadest technology. They need a certain component for their testing system, and they just want to target the experimentation around the components that will fit that system. So maybe it's by mission area. So there's some interesting you know, this is now looking at the portfolio firms, not just the firm itself, right? The need to understand what government officials actually do when they allocate R&D. So when I was looking at a lot of the studies in the past, they actually focus either on the inputs or the outputs, and Tim did a really good job of this. They're not really looking at across agencies. We either proxy a state by who are the lobbyists, what's the social movement driving it, or what are the subsidies and policies. We're not actually looking at the different consultation that happens through. Sean Hyatt has some work that has looked at that, about the consultation between FDA and USDA and others. And then the other thing is, we've often assumed what the state's rationale is for funding ventures based on first economic principles, based on how it fits a national innovation system. But I haven't seen many actually just walk around and watch what government bureaucrats do when they fund this. Is it fit? Do they have this big vision in mind of what the US government should be doing? Or is it just what they actually do? And I think it's open gap for inductive work, really characterizing the different ways these decisions are made irrespective of assumptions. And then finally,
Daniel, thank you for the comments. We're close to the 10 minutes mark.
Sure.
So I'll shortly.
I was thinking of also firm, and this is the last slide actually, if that's okay. Can I go through it? Yeah, very quick. So the other thing is also thinking of selection from the firm side rather than the state side. And that's a debate, right? Is government a feeder into these programs, or is private sector a divergent path, right? Are you actually selecting in a government to do something to go into private or not? And that's kind of where I think this world takes us. And that's all I had. Thank you. Sorry I was a little bit late.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Daniel. Since we have a few questions, I will unmute the people who ask questions in the chat and ask them to just speak and answer and ask their question live so that Tim has a chance to address them. So the first one I have is from Mani, who I see is live. So you can unmute yourself and ask the question if you'd like.
Thank you for the opportunity. And my question relates to the government's desire to bring about the balancing in terms of economy and diversity in terms of the nature of the economy. Say, for example, states in the Midwest and agricultural areas to be converted into industrial hubs. So there could be a direction by the government to sort of support the commercialization of new innovations and industries through organic growth. So that is my point as one of the reasons for allocation of funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mani. What I will do, since we're a little bit short on time, I will ask the other people in the audience who has questions to unmute themselves and ask the questions, and then Tim can give a collective answer at the end. So the second question is from Atanu. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Atanu, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the question directly, please do so.
Yeah, good morning. My question is very simple. I just wanted Professor Timothy's view. Do you think that government needs to fund the risky long-term entrepreneurial venture with a lot of uncertainties, but may have potential to impact the society at large? And the reason is simply such project may not be of choice to the Ps and VCs. So that's one part. And the second thing, I was just thinking that, you know, the observation that you made, I think, argument that whether government have the capability to do the right selection. So here my take is that even if government don't have the capability, but they have the capability to engage experts with the right capability to do the selection, and government can only provide the funds and take the risk, because otherwise the risky ventures may not take off. That's my view. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Atanu. And last but not least, we have a question from Azim. I'll ask Azim to ask the question himself directly.
Thanks, Kira. Tim, that was really interesting. I guess, I think this actually connects to the question Atanu just asked, but, you know, I think you have kind of these two dependent variables, and I was wondering, or two sets of dependent variables. one really focused on commercialization, venture support, IPO, etc. The other really focused on the sort of originality and creativity of the technology. And I would be curious to know what the relationship between them is. So are they funding, are these the same, are the creative ventures and the risky ventures also the one that are getting, lower time to VC and IPO, or are they, so are these complements or substitutes in some sense? And because I think that speaks to whether, the government is just doing what VC would have done anyway, or is it doing something different, which is really the sort of Mazzucato argument, right? So I'd be curious to know if you've looked at the relationship between those two DVs.
Tim, would you like to address the questions in about 3 minutes?
Sure. First of all, Atanu, I appreciate your comment, and it relates to what Asim was saying, actually. These risky ventures that we found, the relationship may not be invested in by VCs, and so the government can step in and play a complementary role there. Asim, I'm not exactly sure what relationship you're talking about, but something that resonated is in fact, are the results that we're getting because VC, I think you're saying, are they complements or substitutes to the venture capital market? And I don't have any analysis to support either one, I suppose. Although we do at one point, I think we do control for venture capital investment. Actually, that may be a control to that. So even if it's not in the analysis that I presented, some of our analysis includes controls for venture capital investment, and we still see these risky and positive effects. And so that, to me, what does that suggest? What do you think?
I mean, I think what I was thinking of more was almost a mediation analysis, which looks at whether the subsequent patenting performance mediates the partially or mediates the outcomes in terms of VC IPO, or are those really independent things where there's a set of ventures that are getting added that are less innovative, and there's a set that are getting added and those are independent. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's really an AND function versus an OR function. And right. If it was an AND function, you would see a partial mediation. And that would be really kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I mean, I know it's a published paper and all that, but still.
Yeah, I know. That's one of the problems with presenting published papers. But yeah, that's interesting. Well, my co-author Supradeep is on the line, so we may, just out of curiosity, look to see whether that mediation effect is present. So thank you very much. Might be good future research too, actually. Thank you, Chiara. And Daniel, your comments were fabulous. Really appreciate those. And I think I'd just like to close just in a half a minute and think this is a real promising area. I mean, I think we don't do enough in strategy and entrepreneurship on policy issues. And this is something that I'd like to devote some attention to, starting with this paper, but beyond this. And I think we need to understand better, how our work can influence policy.
Thank you so much, Tim. So I will leave the floor shortly to Robin, who has a few final announcements to make. But before that, I would like to thank everyone for joining. We are rounding up this summer series of the seminar, but there is a REACH program coming up. So it's been wonderful to close with Tim's very interesting presentation. Daniel has done a very tough job in discussing and already accepted for publication paper, but I think he did a wonderful job. Thank you as always for the questions. And I would also like to thank, of course, Robin, who's doing all the hard work for these seminars, Elizabeth Lyons, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, but she's been putting a lot of work in organizing the seminars, and Azim as well, who's been doing a lot of work behind the scene. So with this, I'd like to leave the floor to Robin for the final announcements.